Hi there, my name is Christy Polar and I'm your instructor for New England and the Civil War. I hope you're joining us for this whole series. This is just the second one. The first one was the welcome, that was last week, and this class is on Google Classroom. So I hope that you join us for the entire series. It's going to be a lot of interesting information. This time we're talking about slavery in New England. This is the syllabus that you see here, and we have it split into three sections: pre-war, the war starting, and after the war. So we're in the pre-war section right now. And as you can see here, we're highlighting slavery in New England. New England, whether we wanted to admit it or not, or acknowledge it or not, played a huge role in the advance of slavery in the colonies. There were a lot of firsts and most that came out of New England. Not very proud of that, not our finest moment, but we really do need to acknowledge it and talk about it. So here we go. Slavery in New England. The first slaves were brought to the colonies in 1619 through Jamestown. That's when the first boatload of slaves actually came into into America. And even though New England colonies did a lot in slavery prior to this, by the 1700s, however, slavery was firmly ingrained in the New England lifestyle. Like I said, by the early 1700s, nearly 30% of the Kingston, Rhode Island population were slaves. That's a huge number. 10% of the Boston population were slaves. Now, think of the size of Boston. Boston was a big city. 10%, that's a big number. That just really shows you how much New England has to do with slavery. Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island were the states that had the largest slave presence in New England. Why was that? Because they really had coastal towns. They had big port cities like Boston and New Haven and Newport, which was huge in the slave trade. And because of that, there was a triangle trade. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit. But basically, it's molasses to rum to slaves. So it's really was the main route that the slave ships took when they were exchanging goods for unfinished goods for finished goods, basically. And the route that they took kind of looked like a triangle. So it became known as the triangle. There we go. So that was a very powerful scene, obviously. And it does talk a lot about really what the triangle trade was and how New England had a big part in it. And which was one of the reasons the South had so much trouble wrapping their head around why New England was so eager to get rid of all things slave-like during the Declaration of Independence. So let's talk about the triangle trade itself. You can see some illustrations here that show you the look of the triangle part of it. The trade, of course, a method of commerce. There are three legs, three sections of the triangle trade, just like a triangle. The first leg was Europe to Africa. The trade items were put on the ships. They left ports like London, and they were brought to the coast of Africa. At that point in time, the goods there would be exchanged for slaves. And what would happen would be that slave hunters who were on these ships would go inland, and they would go after tribes that were inland, and they would capture strong women, and strong boys, and they would take them prisoner and put them on the ship. And the more slaves they could get, obviously, the more the ship's captain would be paid by the person who was funding or sponsoring the journey. So obviously, the more they could, as you saw in 1776, the more slaves that were crammed on the ships, the better a profit that would be made. So then at that point in time, the second leg of the trip would start, which was the Middle Passage. And of course, if being taken from your family wasn't scary enough, this Middle Passage was certainly by far the most horrendous part of the journey. They were in the ships. They were literally body to body all the way across the deck of the ship that they were on. It had poor air circulation. There were people getting sick from seasickness. Disease ran rampant. The hygiene was not to be found. I mean, they would literally bring these slaves up and hose them down with water to clean them off. It was just awful, and it was a long journey. The measure of a good ship's captain was how many slaves he could bring back to whoever was his, funding this project. The more he could bring back, the better ship captain he was, and then he would be hired to go out again. So then we go to the third leg, which was the shipment of the raw goods from America back to Europe. And these raw goods would, of course, be the molasses, sugar, cotton, rice. And so this is how the triangle kept going. So after a while, Europe was kind of taken out of the algorithm and New England was put in. New England mills and factories were taking their own raw goods and creating things, which is normally what happened in Europe. So Europe was taken out, New England became a huge part of this triangle. So then the slaves stayed in New England, and then they either stayed up in the north, or they would be bought and brought down south. Not to say that there weren't places down south, as you can see from the top map, from the National Geographic map. There certainly were places in the south where the same thing happened, but New England had such a huge part of it because they were so quick to have mills and factories and be able to convert those raw goods into sellable materials. So did you know, there's a few things here about slavery, like I had mentioned the first and the most. There's a lot about New England that really set the tone for slavery. Massachusetts, of course, even though slaves first came into Virginia, Massachusetts was the first colony to actually legalize slaves. The term slavery was legalized in the 1640s, and they also, something called chattel, they also decreed that children of slaves became slaves automatically. So it was a generational thing. Rhode Island was the last New England colony to actually end the slave trade. South Kingston was actually one of the towns that had the strictest slave punishments. And there's more about Rhode Island that we're going to learn in later times as far as the abolishment of slavery goes. So it will turn itself around. However, they had strict slave punishments. If someone helped a slave escape, both that person and the slave would be beaten very severely. And then Newport, of course, was the colony's most active slave port. Rhode Island funded over 900 slave triangle trade trips, and most of that came out of Newport. Newport had nearly 60,000 slaves that they brought into America, into the colonies, came through Newport. So Newport was, lots of money coming into Newport. It was a very profitable thing. So what did slaves in New England do? They didn't have big plantations, not everywhere, there were some, but they didn't have big plantations. So why was there such a draw to keep slaves in New England? Farm work was big. Farms around Western Massachusetts had 1 to 2 slaves, 2 to 4 slaves at a time. The people who owned the farm would actually be in the fields harvesting together with the slaves. In the Narragansett area of Rhode Island, there were large plantations. They did, just like the South, they did have 30 to 40 slaves a piece in these plantations. But for the most part, almost all the slaves in New England did household work, domestic work. They were laundresses, they did sewing, seamstresses, the men did heavy lifting, chopping wood, trades. They were taught blacksmithing, masonry, and the people that owned the slaves would actually sell their services out. So seamstresses, they made dresses for other people and they brought the money back for their masters. And that's how, actually going into the future, that's how a lot of these slaves would purchase their own freedom. They lived inside the house, whereas down south they had slave quarters. They lived inside the houses in New England. They lived in the attics and the cellars. And there was not a large slave community like you see down south, where all the slaves would get together. They would have, from plantation to plantation even, they would get together for big parties and all of this stuff. Not that the North didn't have their share of parties and things where slaves, would be with their masters. But for the most part, they were spread out. And they did not have that community that they have in the South. It was just, they were spread over a large geographic area. So how did slavery begin to die out in New England? There was a lot of different ways that things started to peter out a little bit. New England just simply did not have the work to sustain a slave population. They were very industrial. They became industrial very quickly. Slavery was not as profitable for them as it would be for the South. New England began to ascend to a different moral high ground as well. The South saw that profitability as long lasting, and it became terrifying when the idea of that profitability would go away. A lot of civil liberty began to happen with that moral high ground in New England. Court cases in Boston and New Haven began to come to light in the mid-1700s, where slaves began to sue their masters. Not all of them won, but it brought great exposure to what how unethical and how morally ambiguous slavery was. And then again, with the Revolutionary War, blacks would be freed. Many blacks were promised their freedom if they fought with the Continental Army. From American Battlefield Trust, this great quotation here, the most famous mixed race fighting unit on the Patriot side during the Revolutionary War was the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, organized in 1778, though their role was limited to the northern theater of the war. The organization of this regiment was endorsed by George Washington, and listing in the regiment were 88 slaves who were guaranteed their freedom at the end of their service. And so this happened with a lot of northern slaves. So by the time the war was over, there were a lot of freed slaves, freed blacks living in New England. And they just didn't have the stamina to continue on with slavery. So from here, we go on to emancipation in the northern states in New England, and then we go on to spread the word of the abolition of slavery throughout America. So New England, after they go ahead and emancipate their slaves and abolish slavery, which we'll talk about next time, they're going to take that sentiment and spread it throughout the country. And they're going to take the lead and say, you know what, slavery is wrong, it's unethical, it's immoral, and you shouldn't be doing it down south or wherever else they happen to be. And this is going to have a lot of impact on everything from the laws affecting colonies as they became states to the ratio of governing officials. So there's a lot that we're going to learn next time in the rise of abolition in New England. So we're going to talk about the emancipation of slaves in New England, the gradual end to the slave trade, who the abolitionists from New England were, the publications that were created in New England about anti-slavery, and then those laws, such as when Maine became a state that came into the Union in 1820, and how that affected having slaves versus abolishing slaves. So I hope you stick with me, and I will be talking to you soon. Check this out on Google Classrooms if you want to watch this streamed video. And if you have questions, please, right there in Google Classroom, go ahead and ask your questions, and I will answer them. Thank you so much. Take care.